Good evening. Hello, all three people that are listening right now. Oh my gosh, Chicken Patty and all my friends. Hello. Plenty to talk about tonight. I'm not going to stay on too long. I'm going to stay on about 15 minutes and go back to watching my Wizards game. But at any rate, what I'm talking about is the world order. How's this? That's a great time sound. That's a great phrase to use, is it? For years, people have been talking about the new world order ever since I think it was 1990 or so, when or late 80s, early 90s, when George Bush Sr. was talking about a new world order. People tried to interpret that. What does it mean, etc. So let's talk about what I'm talking about when I talk about a world order. Okay. There is the world order through the eyes of the world, and there's the world order through the eyes of the U.S. empire, right? The U.S. empire sees a world order. I mean, you're an American. How long has America been doing that stuff, right? We're the shining city on the hill. We're the beacon of democracy. What does America always say within America? The president of America is the leader of the free world, right? The U.S., if you really think about it, we claim to be a nation, but it's very clear in our language that the U.S. considers itself an empire and considers itself the world's premier empire, the world's owner, the world's authority. Let's talk about how that came about. 1945. After World War II, the U.S. had a distinct advantage. It was far away. It wasn't easy for the Germans or the Japanese or anyone to get here. They made it to Pearl Harbor, but not a whole lot further. We're just too far away. It takes you a long time to get here. The U.S. could deploy ships, all kinds of things, and fight you all the way. Not to mention, if you come here to fight the U.S., what about where do your supply lines come from? How do you resupply? You don't, because your supply ships don't get through. So the bottom line is, at the end of World War II, here's the U.S. sitting here, already considering itself an empire, already acting like one in its own hemisphere for a long time. And the U.S. decided, well, wait a minute. Europe is all bombed flat. Japan is all bombed flat. The entire world is poor. The entire world is in deep and serious trouble, except us. The U.S. economy is booming. So the U.S. economy decides to take advantage of it and become the world's premier empire. And it really worked, because when it came to manufacturing, if you think about it, the rest of the world was yay high, right? It was bombed flat. They didn't have an industry. They didn't have the things. We had everything we needed right here. And our economy and our infrastructure was still basically intact. So the U.S. was able to take advantage of that and build this powerful empire. And it was easy to get a job. It was easy to live here because we had all the advantages. Now, there was an alternate. And the Soviet Union, would I call it an empire? Not really. Not really. I wouldn't call the Soviet Union an empire in the same way that I would call the U.S. an empire, for this reason. The Soviet Union, after, would tend to grab some countries around its borders, right? I'll put it like this. It expanded. It would expand right around its borders, mainly for protection, mainly because Russia had been attacked in the past, and they started saying, hey, we get this country, we got somewhat of a buffer zone. People can't easily get to us. So the Soviet Union, when they were the Soviet Union, was trying more than anything else to maintain a buffer zone so people couldn't easily get in. The alleyways that they had been attacked in the past, they were trying to cut those off. That was what they were doing. So it wasn't the Soviet Union was not an empire in the same way that the U.S. was over in this island and that island in Africa and Middle East and all over the world, trying to get a grip and take over countries and get power, right? So you had an empire like the U.S., but you had another powerhouse in the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, 1991, a lot of people don't know anything about the disintegration of Russia, of the Soviet Union. Around 1991, the Soviet Union kind of, it's interesting. People say that Reagan destroyed the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union pretty much disintegrated. At some point, the Soviet Union realized that the people in Russia, which was the main country, were getting angry, saying, why does people in all these satellite countries living so good and we're living rough? It got expensive. And after a while, the Soviet Union just said, screw this, man, we're going to go in another direction. So the 1990s was considered the lost decade in Russia itself. So one of the things that happened was, and you can look this up, go online and search Harvard boys go to Russia. There were a number of Americans, Harvard guys from the Harvard Kennedy School, Larry Summers, Jeffrey Sachs, a number of them went over to Russia, and they claimed that they were going to do shock therapy, right, for the Russian people, that they were going to, cut everything, neoliberalism. They instituted neoliberalism with a little something extra. So what they started doing basically when Russia, the U.S. had a puppet in. They had their whatchamacallit guy in. I'm having a brain cramp here. You know who he is. But anyway, the guy that was running Russia in the 90s. He was an alcoholic. He was pretty much a puppet for the West. And what was the U.S. and the U.K. and the other countries doing when they said, we're going to come in and help you change your state capitalism, which is what it really was. That's what Lenin called it, state capitalism. We're going to turn that into our form of Western capitalism. And you see how that's worked out. Okay. But what they really did was pillaged and looted. That's really what the West did. A bunch of Westerners went to Russia and started pillaging. Look, think about it now. Think about these vultures on Wall Street. You give them an entire country and say, you can do anything you want. What are they going to do? They're going to loot and pillage. That's what they did in the 1990s. They turned Russia into like the Great Depression, the lost decade around. So you're just a little history around 2000 or so. 1999, 2000, Vladimir Putin became president. The U.S. was happy. They thought he was going to be their guy, and he was going to, Boris Yeltsin, that's the guy, thought that the U.S. was he was going to be their guy. He was going to deliver Russia to them, and they were going to continue to rape and pillage the country and take all of the assets. And Putin kind of put a stop to that crap. Putin, if you look at what he happened, he kind of people are saying that he crushed the oligarchs. Not really. Putin made deals with some of the oligarchs, right? I mean, you ain't going to crush people with that power. Made deals with some of them, changed some rules, took some of them down, right? Some of them went to jail, etc. But the people of Russia were happy because their country was going to hell. And since then, their economy has grown, and it's kind of more like a normal, if you go to Russia, it's like a normal European country. The cities, they've rebuilt infrastructure. So if you wonder why it is that Vladimir Putin has like 65% approval ratings in Russia, which dropped from like 71, it's because he's their version, from the Russians, their perspective, he's their version of FDR. He came in during a basically a depression and brought him out of the depression. And that's the reality. Like it or not like it, whatever you think, that's what happened. The Russians are feeling better than they were before, living better than they were before. So they're happy with their leader. That's the bottom line. Meanwhile, what happens over in China? China decides a couple of things. They decide to open up their labor market to the West, right? You got all these people, this huge labor market in China, and it's not open to the West. China opens their labor market to the West. So what happens? The oligarchs over here get big eyes. Whoa, we got 1 billion people over there, and they're very, very poor, and they'll work cheap. I'll take some of that. So what do the oligarchs in the U.S. do? They then close their businesses. They shutter their factories here, and they move them all. They do the same thing in the north of England, France, all throughout the Western world. They close their factories. They put the Westerners out of work, and they move to China so that they can make more money. Simple as that. And they made a lot more money. And they, of course, took their technology to China, because in order to build what they needed them to build, the Chinese factories needed the technology. And so China goes and takes that technology, expands it. They start growing, right? So the Chinese, Chinese economy has taken more people out of poverty in like the last 20 years than any civilization in the history of humankind. So if you look at China, the Chinese people, there's about a 93% approval rating of the Chinese government. So for all that Americans talk about China and Russia's evil, their people actually like their governments. They're very happy. And if you're just logical, if you forget bias, if you forget ideology, if you forget all of that, right? What have people been saying for years in America about politics? It's the economy, stupid. People vote their pocketbooks, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the same can be said in Russia and China. People voted their pocketbooks. They were doing better off. All right, let's continue on from there. So now Russia's economy is growing. China's economy is growing. You got a country like Iran. Iran's economy is growing. Iran's technology sector is growing. Everything's growing, right? So here's what I'm getting at. You go from a world where the U.S. is the preeminent power, right? Technology leading in everything. And what happens now? The Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians, etc., their technology is catching up, and in some instances passing ours, right? So now the US wants to tell everybody what to do, but you've got countries like Russia and China, and now in South America, Venezuela, you've got countries simply saying, no, we're not going to recognize this world where the US is the sole superpower, is the hyperpower, is the preeminent authority, and everybody else has to listen. So now the US wants a unipolar world, a world in which everything revolves around the US, in which there's Pax Americana. The old term was Pax Britannica, meaning peace that Britain puts forces on the world. Pax Americana being there's peace in the world. There's or in the instance what America is really arguing, or what all empires argue, is that we're bringing order to the world, right? But the order is a self-serving order, because an empire says I'm bringing order to the world, but the order always means I'm in charge of everything and everybody has to listen to me. And if you don't, you die. Oh, by the way, if you got resources in your country that we want, we'll take it, right? So a couple of things happened at the same time. One being China, Russia, Iran, other countries start catching up with the US technologically, and that becomes war machines. So the US is building a lot of war machines and a lot of high-tech war machines, but these other countries are starting to build some pretty good stuff too, enough to really challenge you and possibly make these some of these massive ships that the US has basically floating coffins. I mean, you know, with the missiles that they have now, I would not want to be on an aircraft carrier if a war started, because you're going to be, you know, what are you going to do with hypersonic missiles and various missiles coming at you? You're going to end up dead. That's the bottom line. So the U.S. has what seems to be projected power, but if a war actually started, would the U.S. have power long? I don't know. Surface-to-surface missiles. Again, there's a lot of high-tech stuff out there that matches the U.S.'s high-tech stuff. So who knows what would happen? But do you really, if you're the U.S., do you really want to go and make that move, facing the possibility of, you know, an early loss? Okay, so now the U.S., like Donald Trump, really screwed things up because he exposed the empire for what it is. See, Donald Trump didn't understand how to run an empire, a U.S. empire. In order to run a U.S. empire, you got to be, you want Barack Obama. You want a guy who's going to smile a lot, who's going to sing, who's going to look good in a suit, who's going to seem intelligent, but who will be a vicious, murderous pirate, who will still send your troops around the world, send drones around the world to murder people, steal oil, steal resources. So you need the Barack Obama, the Bill Clintons, the people who are going to pretend that they're nice, but and tell you that they're nice guys and they're working to stop corruption and they're in favor of human rights, as they rob you like a thief and blow your country up and kill your people. That's what you normally get. In comes Trump. Trump doesn't understand the empire. He doesn't even understand that he's running an empire. He thinks it's a nation. So he tries to act like it's a nation. And he asks legitimate questions like, why do we have troops in South Korea? It costs a lot of money. That is a question for a nation. A nation would be concerned about what it costs. An empire doesn't concern, because an empire only says that's a country that we conquered. We got to have troops there to defend the land that we conquered. All Rome did was conquered more and more land and left a certain amount of troops and bases in each conquered land so that they could hold it, right? So if Trump understood what he was doing, that he was running an empire, he wouldn't have to ask why we have troops in Korea as much as it costs, because he'd already know we're an empire. Korea is considered a conquered land. We're going to keep troops there, and so that there are other lands in the area that we haven't conquered, that we desire to conquer, we got to have troops there to launch attacks on them too. That's how an empire works. So now we are dealing with a world where China is projected right now, their economy is projected to pass the US economy in 2028, right? And let's face it, the US economy is in reverse. The China economy is still flying full ahead. I'm betting that number is going to back up by 3 or 4 years. It's going to be more like 2023 or 4 or 5, because our economy is as boneheaded as we are, don't seem to be coming back anytime soon. But so that's what we're up against. The U.S. is telling Iran right now, you've got the Iran nuclear deal. Iran was in that deal. The U.S. jumped out of it. Iran maintained the integrity of the deal for a while and then said, okay, well, screw you. You ain't a deal, neither am I. So now the Iran saying to the U.S., if you want to get back in the deal, we can get back in it. And the U.S. is like, no, you're going to have to do this, and this. And Iran saying that ain't happening. You jumped out of the deal. Number one, you want us back in the deal, you get back in the deal. Number two, you're going to have to show us that we can trust you. So now the Iranians are making certain demands, saying you got out of the deal. You want us back in the deal? Act like you want us back in the deal. If you don't, go jump in the lake. What is that? That's a country challenging the empire, challenging the authority and the supremacy of the U.S. empire. The U.S. is insane. It doesn't know what to do, but it isn't easy to attack them. Because what happens if the U.S. attacks Iran and Iran determines maximum retaliation, right? We got the good news is we've got Iran surrounded in bases. The bad news is they're all within range of Iran's surface-to-surface missiles. So if the U.S. started a war with Iran and Iran wanted maximum retaliation, Iran could close the Straits of Hormuz. They could take out a lot of U.S. soldiers in their bases. Iran could flatten some of our air bases, not to mention they could wipe out Saudi Arabia's oil producing abilities in hours. And Bahrain and UAE and some of these other countries, the U.S. could, the Iranians could wipe out or severely cripple that. Number one. Number two, the Straits of Hormuz, 30% of the world's oil goes through that. Iran could shut it down and make it near impossible for ships to go through. And if the U.S. tried to hold it open, even then, what ship's going to go through a war zone, knowing that you may get shot at? And the U.S. to put ships in there, I might add, they'd be sitting ducks for Iranian missiles. So the bottom line is to start a war with Iran is to risk Iran. Basically, you shut down that oil in the Persian Gulf, you cripple the Saudis' oil supply, the price of oil goes through the oil production ability, the price of oil goes through the roof, the world economy drops into a depression, particularly Europe, because they get so much oil from the Middle East, right? So the U.S. right now is playing with its economy when it screws with Iran and with a good portion of the world's economy. Potentially, we could wipe it out. Meanwhile, China, the U.S. is over in the South China Sea, threatening China, confronting Russia. Right now, China and Russia are kind of sitting back. But to be honest, would the U.S. really want to go to war with China and Russia in their part of the world? How do you think your ships and planes and stuff are going to make out when you're in their part of the world? It's a war you're going to lose if you go to war with Russia and China. You're going to lose that one probably fairly early. Is that something the U.S. really wants to do? Not a good idea. So the U.S. is pushing, but these other countries no longer have to listen to us. And the rest of the world's looking at China saying, look, U.S., you got a big market. There's 330 million people there, but China's got 1.3 billion. They got like 4 times as many people. That's a market we don't want to lose. So it's going to get to a point where the world's going to look at the U.S. and say, if you make us choose between your market and China's market, then it's business. They'll choose China's market. It's bigger and it has more money and all that kind of stuff. It has more potential. You can sell stuff. If you're a salesman and there's 3 people in this room and there's 12 people in that room and you got to try to sell, you're going to go in the room with 12 people, aren't you? You're never going to go in the room with 3. So the bottom line is the U.S. right now is pushing against a world. Coop, your part of the world gets nuked, Garland. Yeah, well, you know what? If there's no such thing as a nuclear game where part of the world gets nuked. Once that button gets pushed, it's done. And I ain't saying it couldn't happen, because as stupid as the people are that run this country, they don't have any better sense than to risk it all the time. But that's all I wanted to chat about a little bit, and that is the U.S. right now making these huge risks. And really our foreign policy seeming to be unhinged right now. It was unhinged under the Trump administration. And again, it's unhinged under the Biden administration. They've sent more troops into Syria. They're sending ships to quote, confront Russia, quote, confront China, etc. Which, I mean, okay, we're sailing ships in their area. If they decide, they can shoot those ships. They can blow them up if they decide it. So how are we confronting them? What are we telling them? That hey, we may decide to have you blow up our ships? But that's the empire. The empire is trying to threaten and flex its muscles and show everybody how tough we are. And the world is laughing at us because the U.S. is falling apart internally. And I mean, all of it, our infrastructure is falling apart. The people are completely and totally divided. We've got 2 parties that, in my opinion, are nothing but a bunch of brainwashed cults. The people in both parties believe just crazy stuff. Both parties. To have any sense at all, you got to be outside of the 2-party system. If you're a member of either one of those parties, you are in crazy la la land, because that's where they both are now. They're cults of personality. They love particular politicians and they circle the wagons around that politician no matter what. Not a concept of these are the policies that I believe in, just some social issues and of some personalities, and that's it. As far as any policies, there's not a grasp of that anymore in the two parties, and that's not accidental. At any rate, I want to thank everybody for coming on. Wow, 51 people. I just wanted to come on for a few minutes and chat just a little bit. I'll be back on tomorrow. How many elected appointed officials hold dual citizenship? I should do an entire show where I talk about Israel. A lot of people wonder what's up with Israel. What does Israel have? I'll just end by saying this. It isn't Israel. Israel's a fort. Israel is a military base. What do you think it's an accident that all the U.S. bases, look at all of those bases we have, and where are they? In the Middle East, where the oil is. Look at most of the countries we've attacked. Where are they? In the Middle East, where the oil is. You see, to an empire, to the U.S., oil is not a fuel. Oil is power. Oil is what you can cut off. If the U.S. wants to be able to cut off other countries' access to oil, you can't buy any more oil anymore. And that's why the U.S. has all of the military bases in the Middle East, to control the flow of oil, for the fear that if the U.S. leaves, another country will come in and control the flow of oil. That's why the U.S. wants to take over Venezuela. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. Do you think the U.S. cares about democracy? What a pathetic joke. Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, UAE, are they democracies? Kuwait, are they democracies? No, the U.S. doesn't care anything about democracy. But Venezuela has a lot of oil. The U.S. wants to control the oil market. Bottom line, they're starving the Venezuelans. They're making their lives a living hell just so they can come in and steal their oil and control their oil. That's what the U.S. is doing. It's extremely evil, but that's what evil empires do. Thanks, everyone. Number one, it's a Zionist. It's a military base. Israel is a military base. It is a place for the U.S. to have an ally that they can arm to the teeth, that they can keep their stuff there. And in the event that they need to go to war to protect the oil, because that's what the U.S. thinks they're doing, they're protecting the oil supplies from any of their adversaries, China or Russia. I guess in this instance, they think that China and Russia may want to take the Middle East and control it. So the U.S. is spending all this money to control the oil and therefore control the power. And that's the plan. And Israel is in the middle of it. And Israel is some place that they can work out of, strike out of, have bases out of. It is a military base, nothing more. At any rate, if you want to get in touch with me, at Garland Nixon on Twitter, I'm asking you to follow me, Garland Nixon, on YouTube. Please subscribe. Please click the little bell so you'll get notified. Share on all of your platforms. Got plenty more to talk about. It's early in the week. Well, no, it's the middle of the week. But I'll be back on tomorrow. I'll be back on this weekend. Anyway, my email is garlandn@gmail.com. Peace. I'm out.